Detective Raymond Holt walked through the courthouse, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who had spent years cultivating power, not just through his badge, but through the quiet control he held over those around him. People stepped aside when he passed. Lawyers nodded in acknowledgement, clerks avoided eye contact, and even the judges gave him the kind of respect reserved for someone who knew all the right people and all the wrong secrets. He had built his reputation as a relentless officer, a man who took justice seriously. At least, that was the version of himself he sold to the public. He was the detective who got results, who made criminals fear the law, who ensured that the streets were clean. But behind that image, there were shadows, deals made in the dark, and lines crossed so often they had blurred into nothing. Holt knew how to make problems disappear. Evidence could be misplaced, witnesses could be intimidated, and if necessary, cases could be built on shaky foundations as long as they served the right purpose. It wasn't about justice. It was about control. And as long as he held it, he was untouchable. Or so he thought. He had taken down countless criminals, but every once in a while, someone got caught in his net who didn't belong there. That was the case today. He glanced down at the file in his hand, the name typed in bold across the front. Elena Vasquez. A woman with no criminal record, no history of trouble, nothing that would make her an obvious target. Yet here she was, facing charges that could ruin her life. He had built a case against her just like he had done to many others before, carefully placing the right pieces in place to ensure there was no escape. Holt had done this long enough to know when a case was airtight. This one wasn't, but it didn't need to be. The judge would see what he wanted them to see. The jury, if it even got that far, would be swayed by the evidence that had been shaped to fit the story Holt needed to tell. The system was predictable, and he had learned how to bend it to his will. Yet something about this case felt different. Elena wasn't panicked when she had been arrested. She hadn't pleaded, hadn't protested like so many others before her. Instead, she had looked him dead in the eye and smiled. It was a small thing, almost unnoticeable, but it had lingered in his mind. He had expected anger, fear, anything but that quiet confidence. Now, as he stepped into the courtroom, he saw her sitting at the defense table, her hands folded neatly in front of her. She looked calm, too calm. It was the kind of composure that didn't come from ignorance, but from certainty, certainty that something was coming. Holt narrowed his eyes. He had been in this game too long to ignore his instincts, and right now, they were telling him something was wrong. He had seen plenty of people walk into courtrooms thinking they had a chance, only to crumble under the weight of the system. But Elena's expression wasn't hopeful, it was expectant. As the judge entered and the courtroom settled, Holt felt the first hint of unease creep into his chest. He told himself it was nothing, that this was just another case, another person who thought they could beat him. But as the proceedings began and Elena met his gaze with that same knowing look, he realized something he hadn't considered before. Maybe this time, he had made a mistake. The courtroom buzzed with hushed murmurs as the proceedings began. Detective Raymond Holt sat in his usual spot, arms crossed, watching the woman at the defense table. Elena Vasquez had barely moved since the moment she entered, her posture relaxed, her expression unreadable. It was as if she wasn't worried at all. That, more than anything, unsettled him. He had seen countless people break under pressure. Some cracked as soon as they were arrested, spilling their desperation in teary confessions. Others held out until the trial, hoping for a miracle that never came. But Elena, she wasn't behaving like someone who was about to be buried under fabricated evidence. She wasn't behaving like someone who had no way out. The judge called for order, and the prosecutor began his opening statement. Holt had worked with the prosecution team on numerous occasions, and he knew the drill. They would paint Elena as a fraudster, a woman who had laundered money through a seemingly legitimate business. They had paperwork proving her involvement, digital footprints leading back to her, and a key witness who would confirm her role in the crime. Except that key witness wasn't real. Holt had arranged it all, just another name on a list of people who had either been bought, coerced, or didn't even exist. The case was designed to be clean, straightforward, impossible to challenge. Yet Elena sat there, unaffected. When her attorney rose for the defense's opening statement, Holt leaned forward slightly. He didn't recognize the lawyer, a young woman with sharp eyes and a tone of voice that carried a quiet confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the prosecution will tell you a story today," she began, walking slowly past the jurors. "A carefully crafted, well-rehearsed story meant to make you believe my client is guilty. But stories, as we all know, can be fiction." Holt frowned. It wasn't unusual for defense attorneys to question the prosecution's case, but something about the way she said it made his unease deepen. "The evidence against my client," the lawyer continued, "is not just weak, it's fabricated." A murmur spread through the courtroom, quickly silenced by the judge's gavel. Holt kept his face expressionless, but his mind was racing. How could they know? The lawyer turned, gesturing toward Elena. "My client is a businesswoman with an impeccable record, no history of fraud, no suspicious transactions, no motive, and yet she finds herself accused of crimes based on evidence that just so happens to appear at the right time." Holt had heard plenty of defense arguments over the years, but this wasn't the usual grasping at straws. This was direct, pointed, almost as if the lawyer turned to the prosecution table. "Detective Holt, I'm sure, will be called as a key witness. After all, he led this investigation." She paused, meeting his gaze. "But what if I told you that his record isn't as spotless as he'd like us to believe?" The tension in the room thickened. Holt's hands tightened around his armrest. That wasn't part of the script. Elena still hadn't spoken, but the ghost of a smile played at her lips. It was subtle, yet unmistakable. She knew. Holt's heartbeat picked up. He had underestimated her. He had assumed she would be just another name, another case swept under the rug. But somehow she had seen through him. Somehow she had come prepared. And for the first time in his career, he felt a flicker of something foreign, something he never thought he would experience in a courtroom. Doubt. The silence in the courtroom stretched, thick and suffocating. Holt could feel the weight of every eye in the room shifting toward him, the unspoken question hanging in the air. What did the defense know? How much could they prove? He forced himself to remain still, his expression neutral. This wasn't the first time a defense lawyer had tried to discredit him. It was a common tactic, throwing accusations into the wind, hoping something would stick. He had weathered it before, and he would do it again. But something about this felt different. Elena Vasquez's attorney didn't look like she was bluffing. There was no desperation in her tone, no uncertainty in her words. She spoke like someone who already had all the pieces in place, someone who knew exactly what she was doing. The judge cleared his throat. "Miss Carter, I will remind you that baseless accusations against a law enforcement officer will not be tolerated in this courtroom." The lawyer, Miss Carter, nodded. "I understand, Your Honor, which is why I intend to present evidence to support my claim." Holt felt a ripple of unease in his gut. Evidence? That was impossible. He had been careful, meticulous. He had orchestrated this case just as he had done with others, ensuring every piece fit perfectly into the puzzle. There was no way they could have found anything. Unless... No. He dismissed the thought. He was in control. He always was. "Proceed," the judge said, his voice carrying a hint of curiosity now. Miss Carter turned toward the jury. "The prosecution's case rests heavily on financial records, transactions that supposedly link my client to fraudulent activities. However, we recently came into possession of documents that contradict the evidence provided by the prosecution. These records suggest that the accounts in question were manipulated." Holt's fingers twitched slightly, but he kept his face impassive. Manipulated? There was no way they could trace anything back to him. He had worked with the right people, covered every track. Miss Carter continued, her voice steady. "Furthermore, we have reason to believe that a certain key witness set to testify against my client does not exist." A murmur spread through the courtroom again, this time louder. The judge banged his gavel. Order. Holt clenched his jaw. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The prosecutor, a seasoned man named Bennett, stood quickly. "Your Honor, this is an outrageous claim. If the defense believes the witness does not exist, then they should present proof." Miss Carter nodded. "I was hoping you'd say that." She turned to the court clerk, who handed her a thick folder. "We did some digging, Your Honor. The witness in question, James Calloway, has no legal records, No birth certificate, no employment history, no social security number. As far as the system is concerned, he is a ghost. The room fell into stunned silence. Holt's pulse pounded in his ears. His mind raced, calculating, looking for the angle. How? How had she found that out? The judge frowned. Mr. Bennett, do you have a response? The prosecutor hesitated. Holt could see it in his eyes, the same doubt creeping in. Your Honor, the witness is scheduled to testify later. I assure you he will appear before this court. Miss Carter smiled. I'm sure he will, but before he does, I'd like to call a different witness. She turned toward Elena, who finally stood for the first time since the trial had begun. She straightened her blouse, glanced toward Holt, and stepped forward. I would like to testify, she said, her voice calm and confident. Holt's throat went dry. He had been so focused on building his case against her that he had never considered one crucial detail. Maybe, just maybe, Elena Vasquez had been building a case against him too. Elena Vasquez stepped forward, and for the first time since the trial began, Holt felt something close to real fear. Not the fleeting anxiety of a close call, not the irritation of an unexpected challenge. This was different. This was the kind of fear that came when the ground beneath you began to shift, when the walls you had built started to crack. She moved with deliberate ease, her expression composed, her shoulders squared. Holt had seen people take the stand before, some hesitant, some arrogant, some desperate to prove their innocence. But Elena wasn't any of those things. She wasn't pleading for justice or hoping for mercy. She looked like a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. The bailiff swore her in, and she took her seat, hands folded in her lap. The courtroom had gone utterly silent, the air thick with expectation. Miss Carter approached her with that same quiet confidence. Miss Vasquez, thank you for coming forward. Let's start with the basics. Do you know why you were arrested? Elena tilted her head slightly. Yes, I was accused of financial fraud, laundering money through my business. And did you commit this crime? No. There was no hesitation in her voice. No anger, just a simple, unshakable truth. Miss Carter nodded. Let's talk about the evidence presented against you. Were you aware of the fraudulent transactions before your arrest? Elena exhaled slowly, as if choosing her words carefully. I was aware that something was wrong, yes, but not in the way they claimed. I had noticed discrepancies, small amounts of money moving in ways that didn't add up. I started asking questions. That's when I became a problem. A problem to whom? Elena turned her gaze toward Holt. To Detective Holt. The room felt as if it had lost all its oxygen. Holt's stomach tightened, but he kept his expression blank. He had dealt with threats before. This was just another one. Miss Carter glanced at the jury, letting the weight of that statement settle before continuing. Are you saying Detective Holt had a reason to want you out of the way? Yes. Elena leaned forward slightly, her voice steady. Because I found out that the fraud I was accused of wasn't committed by me. It was orchestrated by him. The tension in the courtroom erupted into gasps and whispers. The judge's gavel came down hard. Order! Order in this courtroom! Holt forced himself to remain still, but every instinct was screaming at him to act, to shut this down before it spiraled further. Miss Carter didn't even flinch. She turned back to Elena. You're saying Detective Holt framed you? Yes. Do you have proof? For the first time since the trial began, Elena smiled. Not a smirk, not a nervous twitch, but a knowing, deliberate smile. Yes, I do. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small USB drive, holding it up for the court to see. Before I was arrested, I started keeping records, transactions, messages, audio recordings. At first, I didn't know what I was looking at, but the deeper I dug, the clearer it became. Detective Holt wasn't investigating a crime. He was covering up his own. Holt's blood ran cold. Miss Carter turned to the judge. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I would like to submit this drive into evidence. The judge's eyes narrowed. Bailiff, take the drive and have it examined immediately. The bailiff moved swiftly, taking the small device and handing it over for review. Meanwhile, Holt felt the walls closing in. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had always been in control. He had always dictated how things played out. But now, for the first time in his career, he was no longer the hunter. He was the hunted. The courtroom felt suffocating. Holt could hear the murmur of voices, the shuffling of papers, but none of it registered. His mind was racing, calculating, searching for a way out. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The trial was meant to be routine, just another carefully orchestrated case where he controlled the narrative. But now the narrative was slipping from his grip. The judge leaned forward, addressing the bailiff. Has the evidence been reviewed? A forensic analyst who had been called in to examine the contents of the USB drive stood and cleared his throat. Yes, Your Honor. The drive contains multiple financial records, emails, and audio recordings. They indicate a pattern of fraudulent activity tied to accounts controlled by Detective Holt. A ripple of shock went through the courtroom. Holt's jaw tightened. He had always been careful. How had he missed this? Miss Carter turned back to Alina. Can you tell the court how you obtained these records? Elena nodded. After I noticed discrepancies in my company's accounts, I started tracing the transactions. I found a link to an external source, one that led back to accounts controlled by Holt under a shell corporation. When I tried to report it, I was warned to stop asking questions. And when I didn't? She glanced briefly at Holt before turning back to Miss Carter. That's when I was arrested. The prosecutor, Bennett, was already flipping through his notes, his face paling. This wasn't just a weak case. It was unraveling right in front of him. He cleared his throat and stood. Your Honor, Miss Carter cut him off. Your Honor, in light of this new evidence, the defense moves to have all charges against my client dropped immediately. The judge's expression was unreadable as he turned to Bennett. Mr. Bennett, given the circumstances, does the prosecution wish to contest? Bennett hesitated. Well, he was a career prosecutor, and he had worked with Holt on many cases before. But he wasn't stupid. The evidence was damning. He could already see the headlines forming in his head. If he fought this and it turned out to be true, his entire reputation would go down with Holt's. After a long pause, he exhaled sharply. The prosecution does not contest. Holt's stomach clenched. The judge turned back to Elena. Ms. Vasquez, all charges against you are hereby dismissed. He slammed the gavel down. A wave of relief spread across the defense table, but Holt barely heard it. The walls were closing in fast. Then the judge's gaze shifted to him. Detective Holt, based on the information presented, I am ordering an immediate internal review into your conduct. You are to surrender your badge and firearm pending further investigation. The words rang in Holt's ears like a death sentence. Surrender his badge, his firearm, his control? This wasn't happening. The bailiff approached, and for the first time in his career, Holt felt true helplessness. His badge, his shield, his power was unpinned from his belt and placed onto the judge's desk. His gun was taken next, leaving him exposed, vulnerable. He turned to look at Elena. She met his gaze, but there was no gloating in her expression. No smug satisfaction, just quiet certainty. She had known from the moment this had started that she wasn't the one on trial. He was. As the courtroom emptied, whispers filled the air. Holt barely noticed as two uniformed officers stepped toward him. Detective Holt, one of them said, his voice cold, impersonal. You're coming with us. Handcuffs clicked around his wrists, and just like that, the untouchable detective fell.